everyone. My name is Everett McKay, and I'm the principal of UX Design Edge, and I'm also the author of Intuitive Design: 8 Steps to an Intuitive UI. I look forward to my upcoming talk with Hewitt Academy on September 15th, and I thought it would be fun to share a bit of the backstory behind how I personally became involved with intuitive design, and also a bit about what the talk is going to be all about. I've been doing UX design now for over 30 years, and my career has been broken up into 3 even segments. The first 10 years I was a UI developer, so I spent a lot of time writing code and designing a lot of the UIs that I coded. Next, I was at Microsoft for about 10 years, where I was responsible for design for both Windows Client as well as Windows Server. And then I started UX Design Edge in 2010, and my goal there was to focus on UX design training and consulting. And when I started my business, I actually was more interested in training. I'm doing more consulting, way more consulting now than training, but when I started, I was very interested in training. I had a lot of experience doing design training at Microsoft. That was something I did a lot of there. I really enjoyed it, so I thought that would be a great way to get started. So what I did is I came up with a list of learning objectives for my training. And at the very top of the list is I wanted all my students to understand exactly what an intuitive UI was. However, there was just one small problem, which is that, quite frankly, I wasn't really too sure what it meant myself. Like many designers, I had kind of a intuitive understanding of what it means to be intuitive, so I could talk about it and kind of work through it, but quite frankly, at the time, I think most of what I would have said would kind of sound like subjective personal opinion. And I wanted something better than that. I wanted my students to be very objective and very authoritative when they analyze a UI and be able to persuade someone else of whether or not it was intuitive. So I remember the very first thing I did, in fact, I did it in my office, is I came up with, right here, I had like a big stack of all my design books, and I went through them one by one, and I looked up the word intuitive in the index. Now, we use the term intuitive design all the time, so you'd think that'd be the most meaningful thing in the world and that every design book would talk about it. You would be wrong. In fact, of my big giant stack of books, only 2 had the word intuitive in the index. And quite frankly, I don't remember the first one. It wasn't very interesting, but the second book was Jeff Raskin's Humane Design. And in Humane Design, Jeff Raskin defines intuitive to mean familiar. I don't think, however, that's very helpful because, first of all, we're basically exchanging one abstract subjective conversation for another. So instead of talking about whether or not something is intuitive, we're talking about whether or not something is familiar. Where does that get us? But I think the bigger problem is it's just flat out wrong. Being familiar is not the same as being intuitive. So just to prove that very simply, think about this. What exactly is a good synonym for familiar? Well, wouldn't that be like an everyday thing? Well, if you're familiar with Don Norman's The Design of Everyday Things, you'll realize that this is a giant book that explains why familiar everyday things aren't intuitive. And so if all we had to do was make things familiar, this book would not exist. So I started putting deep thought into what exactly it meant for design and interaction to be intuitive, and I realized the key to success was to break interactions down into what I'm calling the interaction life cycle, right? So we start with a user goal. The user wants to achieve something. We have a desired outcome. We can take that interaction and break it down into individual sub-steps. And the idea is if we can get through all the individual sub-steps smoothly, we have an intuitive interaction. And so that's what I'm calling the 8 steps to an intuitive UI. But here's the thing. It turns out that these individual sub-steps are a whole lot more meaningful than the concept of intuitive design by itself. For example, the first sub-step is discoverability, right? So the user has a goal, they need to accomplish something. The first thing they need to do is find the thing in the program, the product that's going to enable them in order to achieve that goal. So that's discoverability. And that's a whole lot more meaningful than intuitive. We can have a discussion about whether or not a feature is discoverable, and we can measure that, we can talk about it, we can design it. So the individual sub-steps are a whole lot more meaningful, and so that really helps us understand intuitive design much, much better. So here's what we need to do. We need to take that interaction lifecycle, break it down into individual steps, give each step a very clear definition. We need to look for design patterns that either help or harm achieving those steps. We need to define heuristics for each of those steps. And of course, we need modern real-world examples to illustrate exactly what we're talking about. And that's what my intuitive design book is ultimately all about, is doing that exercise. When I was done, I realized that I had 52 very strong intuitive design heuristics. I had 52 of them. 52? Are you thinking what I'm thinking? Because what I'm thinking is that would make a fantastic deck of playing cards. And that's exactly what I did, is I came up with the intuitive design heuristics playing cards. And so the great thing about this is it takes the content out of the book. It makes it very, very practical. We can use these when we're trying to understand and persuade other people. We can use them in design reviews and heuristic evaluations. And the great thing is, if we do it in terms of the heuristics, it doesn't sound like personal opinion anymore. It sounds much, much more objective and much, much more actionable because we know what these things mean. So that leads to my talk. So what I want to do in my talk is I first want to explore the business case for why having an intuitive design matters to your organization, to your product, and also to you personally as a designer. The next thing we're going to do is come up with a very objective, practical definition for what it means to be intuitive. Then we're going to look at that interaction lifecycle, break it down into each of the 8 steps. Then we're going to look at the heuristic playing cards and see how we can use these in practical situations. And then we're going to actually do it. We're going to do a heuristic evaluation of a website, and we're going to figure out how to give feedback based on the intuitive design heuristics. And so the great thing about this is that you'll have a good understanding of what it means to be intuitive, and your feedback won't sound like personal opinion anymore. So that's it. It's going to be really great, and you're going to learn exactly what intuitive design is all about. I look forward to seeing you then.